It's a great pleasure to do this. This is a great conference. I just want to make three very brief remarks by way of introduction. The first is that obviously this is part of an ongoing conversation that at least began when we met in October in New York and has continued via public seminar and is now continuing through this conference and will continue through public seminar and through future conferences. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. There's a limit to what anyone can say today or yesterday, but this is ongoing. Okay, and I think that's wonderful. And I thank Jeff and Lala and Elzbieta and everyone who's responsible for that. Second point, the panel that we're now moving to bears the question, how do the pandemic and the authoritarian responses to it undermine human rights and gender justice? The papers are all really interesting. I think they all address the question of how the pandemic intersects with the inequalities in civil society in the range of countries that we're talking about, especially gender, but also race and ethnicity and class, and the dynamics of the political systems involved, and especially the reactionary social policies of right-wing authoritarian governments. Okay, so I think now we can just listen to our wonderful participants. I'm a pretty strict moderator, and I hope that each of the participants can stay within 5 minutes so that there's a lot of time for discussion. And I prefer that we go in the order that's on the program, if that's okay. And that would mean that Kálmán goes first.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just go back to Michal Vašečka's yesterday presentation, because he warned everybody of us that Slovakia is moving from the mafia state to a Paris state. So I go back to last year presidential elections that was won by Mrs. Čaputová, who is generally considered as liberal, and then a lot of international the international media referred to Slovakian presidential elections that liberalism won, and I think that it's simply a failure. So the simple fact that Mrs. Čaputová won doesn't mean that Slovakia turned liberal. But the truth is also that the fact that Mr. Matovič and his party won the parliamentary elections in Slovakia doesn't mean that the whole Slovakia turned conservative. The fact is that Mr. Matovič came to power in a very strange period after in the middle of the corona crisis, and in a very unexpected way. Mr. Matovič is absolutely not prepared to govern. So he has never had any executive function. He has all the time been an opposition politician. He has no international experience. And the fact is that during the many measures of the government, of the Mr. Matovič's government, severely interferes with fundamental rights and freedom. Now the problem is that now the question is whether this is deliberate or this is simply the problem of inexperience, of the lack of experience of government, whether it's a result of the fact that there are in fact parallel structures functioning, because the new government has no trust in former civil servants, and it creates parallel structures, various staffs, coordination committees, and in fact these structures work in parallel, which causes a lot of false misunderstanding and chaos. On the other hand, it's also true that as also Elzbieta underlined in her paper that I read, that the tendency to misuse the issues of so-called cultural, ethical questions like gender, abortions, LGBT rights, are very much came into forefront in the last couple of weeks, and it's very evident. Clearly the majority of the present government, of the present governing coalition, the parliament, are conservative people, so not in the normal way of understanding. As the European conservatism, rather this traditional, more dogmatic conservatism that is present in Central Europe, and it really can have serious consequences on the human rights of women, or on the further restriction of the equality in terms of LGBT persons, or even Roma or other ethnic groups. Now the real issue is how to tackle this, or how to deal with this, because when we lived under Fico government, which was a mafia state, so we all of us believed or expected that there will be a change, but there was a real alternative in the opposition during the times of Fico government, and we had an alternative. This alternative came into power, of course, not in that way as we all of us believed, because there is something lacking in the government. 20% of Slovakian citizens who are liberals have no real representation in the parliament. It was just by a margin of 0.06% of votes. But the problem is that what position should we take now? Whether we should be absolutely oppositional, frontally against this new government, so we'll be against two governments, a Fico government and also Matovic government, but then what will be the alternative? Because the alternative at present time is Fico and Kotleba, so one fascist party and former mafia party, who it is looking now that even the more civilized persons of the Fico party are leaving, Mr. Pellegrini and other his companions, and then we will have in the parliament, in the opposition, as an alternative, as a possible alternative to the present government, clearly the Fico party and the fascist party, and this makes the whole issue even more difficult than it looks from the first side. Thank you.
Thank you. There'll be more time to talk about that later. Okay, so Kerem is speaking next on new expertise of authoritarian regimes, how to escape from implementation of international standards, the case of Demirtas and Kavala.
Hi, I'm a lawyer, so my presentation might be an exception in this seminar. So I need to first introduce why the European Court is so important for Turkey and other European authoritarian regimes. As you know, in Turkey and in many other countries, judiciary is not independent, and the opposition people have to go to the European Court to obtain justice. Turkey has been one of the biggest clients of the European Court of Human Rights for the last 2 decades, but recently there have been 2 very important judgments coming from the European Court of Human Rights about Turkey. Why these are different and important than other judgments is that these are the first 2 Article 18 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Article 18 of the Convention is rarely invoked by the European Court. This provision applies only when the applicant's convention rights had been restricted for purposes other than those prescribed in the Convention, namely when the restriction has pursued an ulterior purpose other than the one permitted by the Convention. The Demirtas judgment, delivered in November 2018, was the first ever Article 18 case decided against Turkey. 1 year later, this time in Kavala, the European Court held that Turkey had an ulterior purpose to detain a human rights defender. Of course, those authoritarian governments improved their skills to challenge the implementation of judgments. I will be telling how. So the cases of Mr. Demirtas and Kavala are not over. Selahattin Demirtas, he was the co-chairman of the pro-Kurdish party, People's Democratic Party, and this party got around 13% of votes in the elections held in 2015. Then he became the target of Mr. Erdogan, and he has been imprisoned for 3 separate sequential charges since November 2016. Mr. Demirtas was detained for the first time on 4 November 2016 for membership of an armed terrorist organization. On September 2018, Demirtas was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison in connection with a speech he made at a Nevruz celebration in 2013. On November 2018, the European Court ruled that, among the other violations, Demirtas' pretrial detention was in violation of Article 18 of the Convention, in conjunction with Article 5 of the Convention. And it also ruled that Demirtas should be released. And how the government escaped from this? The government stated that he was convicted for another crime, and I'm representing him, by the way, at the European Court of Human Rights, and we applied Grand Chamber to review the judgment of the chamber as well as the government. In Mr. Kavala's case, Mr. Kavala is a philanthropist and an important human rights figure in Turkey. He was also prosecuted 4 years after the Gezi events that took place in 2013 in Turkey. Mr. Erdogan, as in the case of Demirtas, openly criticized Osman Kavala and called him Turkish Soros. And he was detained without an indictment around 2 years. Late 2019, the European Court decided in favor of Mr. Kavala. And judgment of European Court became final last week, and the government is still not releasing him, despite the fact that the judgment requires Turkey to release him. And now his lawyers, along with leading human rights groups, human rights groups are applying to the Committee of Ministers to implement the judgment.
Thank you. Would you like to maybe say in a couple of sentences how that relates to the question of pandemic?
Oh, yes.
In a couple of sentences. Thank you.
Yeah. After the pandemic, the government decided to pass a new law about execution of penalties. This was already on the agenda, but it was accelerated following the pandemic. And the government used this opportunity once again to criminalize and punish opposition leaders and human rights defenders. Everyone was released, but those who were convicted under anti-terror law left in prison. That meant politicians, human rights defenders, and journalists. And despite the judgments of the European Court in Kavala and Demirtas, they are still in prison, while many others released.
Thank you. That's excellent. Next is Jan Orlovsky, speaking on NGO sector in Slovakia as a subject of conspirators. That sounds interesting. They were all interesting. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Unfortunately, the situation with the conspiracy is not new to the sector. And actually, since the foundation of Slovakia, even before, the parts of the sector have always been accused of some wrongdoing. Michal Vasička once gave one fantastic presentation about NGOs in Slovakia, how diverse they are, and that those who accuse parts of the sector of conspiracy don't really realize that the sector includes trade unions, sport organizations, Christian organizations, organizations in social affairs. So there are many, many different activists and organizations who work in the field. Those who get blamed for whatever goes wrong in Slovakia are those who are usually the advocacy groups and those who fight for human rights usually. So it's not different from what you see in United States these days, or Hungary, or in Poland. So the division is very simple: good ones, bad ones. The good ones are those who actually do something with the education or social affairs, but as long as you interfere with human rights or actually democracy and you promote that, you become suspicious. The other charge is that, of course, financing and the conspirators usually are not accustomed to the fact that we are part of the EU now and transatlantic relationship works. Therefore, the funding is not considered foreign anymore because we are part of that world. But there is no sense of trying to make any kind of rational argument with them, because that's a different story. And we lived through this in socialist times as well, when something called National Front was uniting all the non-governmental organizations. So it was people who were the gardeners, people who were dealing with just the military affairs, the people who were dealing with culture or education. So you could form your organization as long as it was basically approved by the Communist Party. And the National Front was a united overseeing body for all the, I would say, civic activism in socialist times. But one famous environmentalist in Slovakia named Nikolaj Huba said, as long as we were just cleaning the water springs and cleaning the forests, it was okay. The communists were patting us on the shoulder saying, fantastic work, thank you very much. Communist Party is grateful. But once we started to interfere with the change of the laws, that the companies would stop soiling the environment, it was basically the work of the evildoers and actually imperialistic effort. So that's what appears to be the case again. Like, as long as you are comforting with the power, you're fine. As long as you start challenging the power, you become enemy, not just for the power, but also for the people who support the power. And in our case, the conspiracy is, of course, George Soros. That's number one. And all the other connections to the something that challenges the traditional values of Slovakia, as if liberal thought was something which was strange to Slovakia. I once had a discussion with one conservative, the guy who started a pro-life movement in Slovakia, saying that, the liberalism was brought in by George Soros. So it really gave me a big smile on my face, because it's like, no, liberalism is not actually invention of George Soros, but we've had it here since the great bourgeois revolution of France. And actually, one of the best liberals in the country were the Protestants and Catholic priests, who actually brought women and girls to the classes and gave them the first education, actually the opportunity for it. So for me, the case is that Slovak politics is at this point, as I think also Kálmán mentioned, and I think Michal mentioned it for sure yesterday, that it's very folksy. It very much reflects that 100 years is not enough in development of any country. Also the parties. Okay, thank you. Yeah, also the parties which are represented now in the parliament are mostly I would say movements united around one leader. So you don't really have the power structure, which is kind of copying classical party structures we would consider a real politics. This is just, so they unite around the leader, NGOs unite around the advocacy issue or a group of people. So for me, this is just repetition of what we've had here 30, 40 years ago, and nothing new, and very much similar to what you experienced in the States as well.
Thank you. That was so concise and excellent. Next is Maria Bucur, who's going to speak on domestic violence as pandemic.
All right, I'm now unmuted and I'm on my own timer, so good to go. I'm not going to rehearse what I said in my piece. I'm going to present some context. When I was asked at the beginning of the pandemic by Jeff Goldfarb to contribute something to a public seminar about gender-related things, I wrote a somewhat optimistic piece called The Gender Challenge. The idea was that now that almost, most people around the world are stuck living in small spaces, and our kind of social has become the kinship group, basically, or the people that we choose to live with during this pandemic, that there was an opportunity to use time differently, to think about our relationship with those that live around us in a way that shakes up our assumptions about gender roles. So that, for instance, you know, who gets to take the garbage out, who gets to enforce parenting rules, who needs to go to the store and put their life in danger for shopping purposes. Anyway, all those things could be rethought. It was optimistic. It was overly optimistic. And my sense now, after 2 months, is that I was wrong in assuming that there was a will, under the kind of duress we're living in right now, the kind of trauma everybody's experiencing, to try to let go of comfortable things like gender norms. That's clearly not happening. So now we are in phase 2 of, as far as I'm concerned, of thinking about these challenges, which is that clearly what's happening around the world, and this is, again, it's not about authoritarian versus democratic. This is everywhere around the world, that domestic violence is going up by between 20 and 30%, right? Already, if you pay attention to the WHO, I do, the 1/3 of women around the world suffer from intimate partner violence of some sort. And these days, I think psychological counts as much as physical, because literally we're all going through some kind of trauma. I know it. And therefore, so what we're talking about is something that was already, as far as I'm concerned, a pandemic, which is why I called it that. If 1/3 of us women, are going through this regularly, this is something that should concern everybody, and especially democracies. So it was not news when this thing happened. Now, all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we're all stuck at home. And yes, guess what happens? Perpetrators, when they lash out, they're going to lash out against whom? Children and their partners. So what have democracies done? Not much in this regard. And that's why I wanted to focus on the American case, because it's an obvious case of, you know, lack of will to deal with the problem when you have a solution in front of you. The Violence Against Women Act has been ongoing since, you know, the 90s, since domestic violence became like an actual issue in public policy making. And what are we doing? Nothing, not paying money to try to help these women. So our solutions are basically, we're gonna prepare some kind of made up temporary budget to help these people on a short-term basis, but we're still not thinking about the kind of overall problem that we're dealing with. That is a problem of education. It's a problem of educating, especially the law enforcement agencies, to recognize this, to find, you know, a different way to engage with the problem. And then, of course, to rely, if there's no government sort of infrastructure, on the quite well-developed non-government organizations, civil society, to engage with these things, to trust those organizations. But that has not happened. So I wanted to bring that up as a case study of sort of that we know the problem, we know what the solutions could be, but yet we're not dealing with the actual needs that are on the ground in any sufficient way. And while I believe that a democratic government and a way of engaging with this problem likely has better chances of engaging with it, we don't have some shining great examples out there of best practices. We're still kind of coming to terms with the fact that this is a societal, you know, large issue. And of course, in the United States, the issue of gun control, which I brought up briefly, is one that we need to, you know, keep in mind, and it's kind of unique to the United States. But even if we take that out, I think there's many comparators. In the case of Romania, and I'll be done after I say that, when I was still in Romania, I was in Romania until the middle of March. At the very beginning of the coronavirus crisis, just one sentence, Jeff, women were calling in to like talk shows with law enforcement and asking, okay, what are you doing for domestic violence? And the answer was, we don't have time to think about this. We don't have the resources to think about this right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was fantastic. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for keeping on time. So our last participant is Elżbieta. Her paper is called Gender Ideology as Pandemic, Anti-Gender Campaigns in a Time of Crisis. And I just want to comment that it's really interesting. So Maria is interested in how gender-based domestic violence is a kind of virus or pandemic. If I understand, and Elżbieta is interested in the way in which genderism is presented as the danger, like feminism basically is the virus that needs to be combated. In any case, Elżbieta, thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I won't be summing up my text because, I mean, you can learn some facts from there, and also I have a commentary about those anti-LGBT zones in Poland if you are interested in those developments. And I would like to talk more about this sort of meta level, what links different contexts in which gender becomes one of the main issues which are politicized today, because I think that there is this tendency to relegate issues connected to reproduction, family, sexuality, to cultural conflicts or culture war. But I think that they are part and parcel of a much broader dynamic, and the real stake is the future of democracy. So I would like to propose some of the conclusions from our book, which we just wrote with Agnieszka Graf, a colleague of mine. Some of you know her very well, which is called Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment. And I think that this is a good way of thinking about the moment in which we are now. Populist moment in a sense, not only of crisis of democracy, crisis of neoliberalism in a way, and liberalism as well, but also following Chantal Mouffe, the moment in which there is a new conjuncture in which neoliberal hegemony is being called into question by a variety of anti-establishment movements, both from the right and from the left. And clearly those from the right are much more visible and powerful. And this is exactly the moment where this coalition between anti-genderism and right-wing populism and authoritarianism comes into place. Because the main issue becomes the question of who are the people and who can really rejuvenate democracy. And of course, the liberal left-wingers have very different ideas about who are the people and who can make legitimate claims on behalf of them. And we call this coalition making between anti-gender movements and right-wing populism an opportunistic synergy. It includes political alliances, ideological affinities, and organizational ties, but it's not necessarily that both of those groups have exactly the same ideas about the world or policy goals. And I think that the Polish struggle around the ban on abortion show this tension between those two groups. And actually, I think that we should recognize that when I talk about anti-gender movements, I think not only about Ordo Juris in Poland or people like National Organization for Marriage in the United States, but these are very well connected, very well networked groups, coalitions, networks as well, which function both on the level of transnational connections in different countries, and they collaborate quite a lot. So since populism is not a robust ideological project, it often feeds on narrative structure arguments which are promoted by anti-gender ultra-conservative movement, but often in selective and opportunistic fashion. And at the same time, what really facilitates that is that anti-gender campaigns, of course, they are using organizational financial resources which are made available to them by the state. But at the same time, what is really important here is that conservative critiques of gender have been framed in populist terms and are thus readily adaptable to populist discourse. So I think that coming back to what been said yesterday by Gabor, I think this question about neoliberalism and the question of the intersection between cultural and political and the economic, what really is important, and I think we should bring it up, is the fact that family values are not only just a smokescreen for what they're really doing, although they often are, but in many countries, including Poland and Hungary, they are part of this kind of project of redistributive state policies. So what they're, and I think that this is an interesting differentiation between, or difference between the US and some of the European countries. So we are not talking about ultra-conservatives or right-wing populists, this is my last sentence, who promote family values in a neoliberal state as part of this neoliberal project. But I think that we have a new configuration in which there is a project of ultra-conservative chauvinist welfare state, and it really makes quite a lot of people much more willing to support this kind of project. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. These are all terrific presentations. Thank you. And now it's time to open it up for broader discussion. And I ask that people indicate on chat that they would like to speak. And also, please keep it very concise, like make a point or ask a question so that lots of people can weigh in and the presenters can respond. We'll start with Shireen.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. I want to just riff off Maria's more hopeful start. Because I don't think it's that misplaced. I do think that the pandemic has opened up the possibility to rethink social reproduction care, more especially who is doing the paid care work, right? Or we could expand that to unpaid care work. But for it to work, for it to have any traction politically, I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves we need to have movements that have the space to make those claims. And the US is an interesting comparator, but so is Canada, you know, which has developed over a period of time feminist movements that have made inroads into what Canada thinks of itself, how it defines its own version of social democracy, in which care is an important part. And so is ending domestic violence. So it's one of the few countries where in the first package of emergency measures, it expanded support to shelters for women. So I think there is a possible politics there.
Thank you, Shireen. And you made it, I saw that you sent a little chat comment on that, which is great. So people can follow up and hopefully we'll talk more about this. So next on the list is, man, this chat thing moved. Okay, is Jacek.
Yes, thank you. I mean, these were great presentations. I have one question to Maria and one to Elżbieta. To Maria, do you see any hope that this increase in domestic violence will actually sort of mainstream the issue, put it more in the front of public policy, and that there will be some actually maybe some positive change out of it? So this is my question to you. And to Elżbieta, I agree with everything you're saying, except that it's not clear to me where this neoliberalism thing comes into this discussion, because just the argument that Kaczyński, as part of his package in Poland, introduced the family benefits, I think is not a sufficient reason to generalize that this global anti-gender movements actually challenge capitalism. I would actually think that the opposite is the case, looking at the fact that they are often sponsored by very wealthy capitalists. But okay, so thanks.
Thank you. Maybe take a minute, each of you, to respond. A minute.
All right. So first of all, Shireen, thank you for restoring my hope. I always want to keep it in front of me because that's the only way to keep moving in this depressing time. So, okay, good. I look at Canada some more and try to revive my hope through that. Jacek, I gotta tell you, I don't know. I'm not a crystal ball looker. I like to be hopeful in general. What I'm seeing, because I just looked at kind of the news breaking out and the stats, what I'm seeing over the past month is that once in a while there's a place in the world where somebody got killed, a woman and her kid, and then there's a news item, but it doesn't get connected to actual issues when it's reported. That's the problem. Like, it's not connected to, oh, well, we should educate law enforcement this way and have shelters for women and funds to, in other words, it's not even a short-term thinking about the solutions. So awareness, I hope so, but I don't see a lot of evidence of thinking structurally about these issues and how they're connected to not just COVID, but pre-COVID issues, because that's the problem. Thank you. Done.
Amazing. You are so concise. Elżbieta?
Thank you very much for this question. And I've been thinking about it long and hard. And probably it's important that I came into this question from studying parental conservative movements. Mm-hmm. So my issue is not only about whether they really fight against neoliberalism, but rather how they position themselves as the main forces fighting neoliberalism. And for this to make sense, we have to understand that neoliberalism is not only about redistribution, but also recognition. So in that sense, it really is about how do we define issues such as crisis of care, which conservatives would say is crisis of family, or the question of low rates of low birth rates in most of developed countries, which they would call the abortion holocaust, and so on and so forth. I think that they've made quite good inroads into a critique of neoliberalism as ideology that supports individualism and which really challenge or brings the crisis of community in its many forms. So in that sense, I think that they are really good at, at criticizing neoliberalism as cultural formation, but also they are doing certain things in the field of social policies, and they are claiming that they will do more. Whether they will, that's the question.
Okay, so we have around 10, thank you, that was great. We have 10 minutes left. There are 6 people who'd like to speak. So the order that I have next is Sasa.
Pandemic and the virus, which is called sometimes that is democratic and attacks anyone, really reveals a lot of social inequalities. We didn't talk so much in this session about that, although it's about human rights. And of course, it really attacks mainly the poorest who suffer more in this situation. And in case of Slovakia, we really had a huge problems in solving situations in the Roma communities, and they were not done properly in human rights way, good way. So I can't say more. We could discuss it, but I think the social inequalities are very, very important in the whole pandemic situation.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Powell? 1 minute.
Thank you. I'll try to be very brief. I'd like to make a short comment regarding the anti-neoliberal nature of some conservative right-wing family organizations in Poland and elsewhere. I agree with Ella when she's making this really important point that surprisingly the arguments that caretaking, domestic work should be valued, and in this sense this is anti-neoliberal. But on the other hand, what they are doing in Poland, for example, but elsewhere too, is they're hollowing out common institutions, like institutions that would offer care and that would offer civic education for small children. And I'll finish with a very straightforward example. Ordo Juris, which is extremely conservative right-wing organization in Poland with ties to Brazil and conservative movement there, is fighting very hard to get another family benefit. And this will be basically a stipend for mothers who decide to stay at home with their children if the children are under the age of 3. So this basically means taking mothers out of the job market, and a strong argument against investing in public services. Thank you.
Thank you. Elżbieta M is next. Please, 1 minute, please.
My question is quick, and it has to do with the legacy of language or vernacular in all I think almost all post-communist countries, in which feminism, socialism, and ideology are still ringing. Feminism, I think, perhaps less so, as connected to the prior regimes. And I wanted to ask, I want us to think about it, what to do about it, how to make disconnect gender and ideology as it is being presented mostly by the church and floats in the society effectively, making people react in a negative way to the issues of women.
Thank you, Elżbieta. Michal? Michal?
Yeah, well, I just wanted, you know, I wrote it that was a question to Elżbieta, and that's a question which is basically saying that, and I don't have a really answer to that, because clerical forces, you know, I'm hesitant to call them conservative forces. Clerical forces have had various options how to mobilize their followers, and they picked up gender ideology, which in my view doesn't, you know, such an animal doesn't exist. And I'm trying to explain it to people in Slovakia repeatedly. And, you know, more and more we are explaining that this is just artificial thing. More and more people believe that there must be something about it, you know. So what is your view on it? Why they picked up gender ideology, this fake thing to mobilize their followers?
Thanks. You know, I want to give people who haven't had a chance to speak yet a chance to speak before we go back to anyone, since the presenters have spoken like more than anyone else. Jeff G is next.
I'll be very brief. Try to do it in 30 seconds. First of all, I still am confused by what the term neoliberal means. It seems to me that it doesn't, it's just too vague. And I think there's a problem if we try to fit everything into that. I want Maria to think of her positive and negative responses simultaneously. We actually have to deal with both and work on the positive response, which I think is actually happening. I think there is evidence that, for example, domestically, the division of labor it is actually fairer now. I think there's actually some data about that. Of course, it's not the same homes where necessarily where the abuse is occurring. And lastly, there's a challenge to have an alternative coalition to the populist coalition.
Excellent, Jeff. Thank you. By the way, these are all great questions, and people are obviously going to be thinking more about them. Utku is next.
Thank you. I have a question for Kerem. So, as in the case of Osman Kavala and Selahattin Demirtas, I think we now obviously see that the Islamist government in Turkey does not comply with the decisions of the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. So I wonder if there's any way for the European public to put further pressure on the court, because the court has been very understanding for the Turkish government for many years, as you always repeatedly just underline in whatever you write, whenever you speak. Thank you.
By the way, we have 3 minutes left and 2 people left on the list. I just want to say, in response to that really good question, we haven't really talked about the transnational dimension of this very much, although it's come up. The discussion has been mainly nation-focused. And the EU court system relates obviously also to the transnational diffusion of anti-genderism and whatever. So there are lots of issues on the table that we need to continue to talk about in the future. That was a great question. Helena and then Daniel. 1 minute, Helena.
Okay, yes,
Helena.
thank you. A quick one. and it's actually transnational because I'm throwing it at all of you. I'm wondering how traditional values could be, or a kind of vision of traditional values could be translated into this agenda that we're talking about, which is human rights, gender rights, LGBT rights, using this notion that is exploited by kind of radical religious movements or radical conservative people in power to enforce a kind of countering agenda, something that Jeff has just mentioned.
Great question. We have two more and we have 2 minutes. Helena, thank you, you just went. Daniel, and then Andres, question mark. Maybe we'll get a chance, we'll see.
Thanks. Really quick one. I was just asking about the trans-regional dimension of this crisis. I mean, I do not believe, of course, authoritarianism is a national problem. The problems of democracies are all national, but this crisis, this pandemic crisis, is a humanitarian one. And also the economic crisis that will follow it. I mean, I don't believe that we will find any answer at a national level of these two questions, the health problem and the economic crisis. So we will need to build a more strong international support, and maybe this will help our nationals to fight authoritarianism.
So let me offer this. Thank you for that, Daniel. Since Andres and Maria have been going at it on chat, and since it's now noon and time for us to end, I'm going to bring this to a close, but I'm going to bring it to a close by following up on what Daniel just said. And it's kind of interesting. I'm looking at everyone's faces. You people are everywhere. This is a transnational meeting. Yes. And maybe that transnational dimension needs to be at the forefront of our next discussion, because we are actually networking now. This is that. And Public Seminar, I think, Democracy Seminar is really trying to do that. So we have a lot more to talk about. I want to thank everyone. People had great things to say, and this was a great session. Thank you.